A police officer attempts to intimidate a black woman during a routine stop. Confident, aggressive, and clearly underestimating her. But everything changes in an instant when he discovers her true identity. She's an undercover FBI agent. What happens next will leave you speechless. Get ready for a shocking twist that flips the power dynamic completely. Before we begin this story, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Your support helps us create more stories that open minds, awaken hearts, and remind us all what true dignity looks like. On a bright Monday morning, Janet Wilson drove leisurely along the bustling streets of Chicago, sunlight dancing across her sleek black sedan. The city buzzed with life, a mixture of hurried pedestrians, busy commuters, and towering skyscrapers gleaming against a cloudless sky. Janet, a senior FBI agent newly transferred to Chicago field office, was still adjusting to her new surroundings. She was respected, confident, and always carried herself with dignified composure. But she preferred simplicity over spotlight. Janet parked briefly near a popular cafe on Roosevelt Road. Wearing her casual yet elegant navy blue pantsuit, she stepped out to grab her usual morning coffee before heading into the FBI office. She greeted the barista warmly, exchanged pleasant small talk, and left minutes later with a steaming cup of coffee, unaware of the watchful eyes observing her every movement. Meanwhile, Officer Rick Howard leaned arrogantly against a patrol car parked just across the street. Rick was notorious among his peers. Competent but ruthless, efficient but discriminatory. His badge had shielded him from consequences numerous times, empowering him with a dangerous sense of invincibility. To him, profiling was second nature, an uncomfortable habit he developed through years of unchecked power. He squinted suspiciously at Janet, immediately dismissing her sophistication. Rick saw only skin color and stereotype, a dangerous combination that had shaped many of his harsh, impulsive judgments. As Janet's car slowly pulled away from the curb, Rick straightened up, adjusting his uniform with a sneer. "Let's see what she's up to," he muttered, starting his engine and flicking on his flashing lights, signaling her to pull over. Janet glanced at her rearview mirror, surprised yet composed. She signaled neatly to the curbside, pulling her vehicle gently to a stop. Calmly, she prepared herself, expecting a routine traffic stop. Unbeknownst to Janet, this moment marked the beginning of an incident that would ignite outrage, expose prejudice, and force the city to confront its hidden shadows. Officer Rick confidently approached Janet's car, hand placed deliberately on his holster. With arrogance in his voice and a smirk curling his lips, he leaned down and asked mockingly, "Do you know why I pulled you over today, miss?" Janet, steadying her voice and eyes fixed firmly ahead, replied politely, "I'm sorry, officer. Actually, I don't." Rick chuckled sarcastically, eyeing her suspiciously. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Let's have a little chat." Janet breathed steadily, remaining calm. She knew her rights, knew her responsibilities, and above all, knew who she was. Stepping carefully out of the car, she stood tall and dignified, her FBI badge concealed beneath her jacket, prepared to handle this encounter with grace. Yet Janet Wilson had no idea just how far Officer Rick Howard would push his ignorance and prejudice before realizing his terrible mistake. Janet stood calmly beside her vehicle, the crisp morning air brushing softly against her composed face. Officer Rick Howard paced arrogantly in front of her, eyeing her up and down with unwarranted suspicion. "License and registration," Rick demanded brusquely, clearly enjoying his display of power. Janet reached smoothly into her purse, producing her driver's license and registration without protest. Rick snatched the documents rudely, briefly glancing at them before turning his narrowed eyes back toward her. "You got quite the fancy car, ma'am," he mocked. "Sure it's yours." Janet's jaw tightened slightly, but she maintained her dignity. "Yes, officer. Everything checks out." Ignoring her response, Rick continued his harassment. "People like you often think you're above the law, don't you?" "Excuse me." Janet's voice remained calm yet firm, her eyes meeting Rick's stare unflinchingly. "You heard me," Rick snapped sharply, stepping closer, using his height to intimidate. "Step aside. I'm going to have to search your vehicle." Janet, knowing her rights intimately, hesitated briefly before speaking clearly. Officer, I don't believe you have probable cause for... Rick sharply interrupted, his voice louder, more aggressive. I said step aside. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Around them, pedestrians paused, murmuring quietly as they watched the tense exchange. A few discreetly began recording the unfolding scene with their phones. Janet stepped aside quietly, her stand still poised and dignified despite the escalating humiliation. Rick began rummaging through her car carelessly, tossing her neatly organized belongings onto the sidewalk. Janet watched silently, her composure tested, but her self-control unwavering. After minutes of pointless searching, Rick stood straight, clearly agitated that he found nothing suspicious. Frustrated, he turned back to Janet, deciding impulsively to escalate the situation. I don't like your attitude. Rick spat venomously, stepping forward aggressively. You're under arrest for obstructing a police investigation. Janet's eyes widened slightly at this absurd accusation. Officer, I've cooperated completely. Before she could finish, Rick roughly grabbed her arm, spinning her around harshly to place cuffs tightly on her wrists, the metal biting uncomfortably into her skin. The humiliation deepened as Janet felt the stares of passers-by, their shocked whispers growing louder. Rick leaned close, whispering cruelly into her ear, maybe this will teach you some respect. Janet's expression hardened, her dignity intact. She chose not to resist physically, but in her heart, she knew Officer Rick Howard had just made the biggest mistake of his life. As Rick guided her forcefully toward the waiting patrol car, neither of them knew that by the end of this encounter, their roles would dramatically reverse, changing their lives forever. The patrol car's tires screeched to a halt outside the precinct, drawing curious eyes from inside the bustling Chicago police station. Janet Wilson remained composed, though her wrists were still tightly bound, red marks visible from the uncomfortable grip of the cuffs. Officer Rick Howard roughly guided her to the precinct doors, clearly reveling in what he perceived as a personal victory. Inside, fellow officers glanced curiously at Janet, noting her elegant attire and dignified composure. Murmurs drifted through the corridors. No one could quite understand why a woman who appeared so professional had been treated so harshly. Rick led Janet into a stark interrogation room, its walls painted dull gray, a single dim light bulb hanging overhead. He forcefully sat her down, smirking arrogantly. Now, are you ready to lose that attitude and cooperate? Rick sneered, crossing his arms defensively. Janet looked him squarely in the eyes, her voice calm but assertive. I've cooperated fully since the beginning, officer. The only attitude problem here is yours. Rick bristled, his face reddening in anger. Don't push me, lady. I could make things a lot worse for you. Outside the interrogation room, the precinct buzzed with curiosity. Captain Henry Dawson noticed the commotion and approached a junior officer who stood nervously near the door. What's going on here? Dawson demanded firmly. Officer Howard arrested some lady. Nobody really knows why, sir, the officer replied timidly, sensing trouble brewing. Captain Dawson's brow furrowed deeply, knowing Howard's troubling reputation. He swiftly moved toward the interrogation room, deciding it was time to intervene personally. Inside, Rick continued berating Janet, his frustration building at her unyielding composure. You people always think you're better than us. Rick spat bitterly. You people, Janet repeated softly, her voice icy yet controlled. Before Rick could respond, the door swung open abruptly. Captain Dawson stood sternly in the doorway, eyes blazing with authority. What's happening here, Howard? Dawson's voice was sharp, cutting through the tense silence. Rick hesitated briefly, caught off guard by Dawson's sudden presence. Sir, she was resisting. Janet calmly interrupted, her tone respectful yet firm. Captain Dawson, I haven't resisted. Your officer arrested me without justification. Captain Dawson eyed Janet, noting her poised demeanor and evident professionalism. His gaze turned back to Rick, suspicion clouding his eyes. Did you verify her identity, Officer Howard? Dawson asked pointedly. Rick blinked, momentarily stunned. No, sir. She refused to. You never asked properly, Janet interjected calmly. With practiced ease, she nodded toward her purse on the table. My identification is there. Rick, suddenly nervous, quickly opened her purse. His confidence faded as he retrieved Janet's badge, hands trembling slightly when he realized the magnitude of his error. He stared down in horror at the FBI identification card, clearly bearing Janet Wilson's photograph and title, Senior Special Agent. Captain Dawson observed Rick's shock, instantly grasping the disastrous mistake his officer had made. "Howard," Dawson spoke coldly, barely controlling his anger. "Step outside now." Rick, visibly shaken, glanced briefly at Janet, his face drained of all arrogance. Reality hit him with crushing force as he understood the consequences waiting outside that door. Outside the interrogation room, Officer Rick Howard stood frozen, gripping Janet's FBI identification card tightly. As reality crashed down around him, his face had gone pale, his breath shallow with panic. Nearby, officers who once admired or feared Rick now cast judgmental glances his way, whispering fiercely behind their hands. Inside the room, Captain Dawson turned respectfully to Janet, his voice filled with sincere regret. "Agent Wilson, I offer my deepest apologies for this inexcusable incident." Dawson spoke earnestly, carefully unlocking the handcuffs from Janet's wrists. He winced slightly upon seeing the faint red marks left behind. Janet rubbed her wrist gently, maintaining her calm, professional demeanor. "Captain Dawson, I appreciate your swift action. However, I trust your department understands the gravity of what happened here." "I assure you," Dawson promised firmly, "we will handle this immediately. Actions have consequences, and Officer Howard has crossed an unforgivable line." Outside, Rick paced anxiously, his heartbeat accelerating with every passing moment. He glanced nervously at the officers who deliberately avoided his gaze. For years, he'd enjoyed unchecked power, but now, for the first time, he felt helpless, trapped by his own arrogance. Suddenly, the interrogation room door swung open. Captain Dawson emerged, his stern expression immediately silencing the room's tense whispers. Janet followed closely behind, poised and authoritative, eyes fixed unwaveringly on Rick. "Officer Howard," Dawson said coldly, voice echoing across the hushed room, "you are suspended, effective immediately, pending a full internal investigation." Rick staggered backward slightly, shock and humiliation flooding his expression. "Sir, please." "You had your chance," Dawson interrupted firmly, raising a hand for silence. "You misused your authority and disgraced this department. This investigation will determine your future here." Rick's shoulders slumped in defeat, the reality of his ruined career hitting him hard. Officers who once admired him now watched disapprovingly, realizing just how far Rick had fallen from grace. Janet stepped forward, her voice clear, composed, and commanding respect. "Officer Howard, your badge doesn't grant you permission to humiliate or discriminate. Your badge represents justice and responsibility. Today, you fail both." Rick remained silent, unable to muster a single defense. His arrogance, his prejudice, everything that once made him feel invincible, now left him completely exposed. Janet turned confidently, walking purposefully toward the precinct's exit. Every eye followed her, a powerful figure embodying justice and dignity. As she stepped out into the sunlight, the whispers inside grew louder, the precinct buzzing with the realization that today marked a turning point, one where prejudice faced swift and undeniable consequences. Left behind, Rick stood alone, surrounded by judgmental gazes, understanding at last that he had been his own worst enemy. The tables had turned, and his reckoning had only just begun. News of Officer Rick Howard's humiliating downfall spread rapidly through Chicago. Videos of Janet's unjust arrest, captured by bystanders, flooded social media, sparking public outrage. Demonstrations erupted, demanding accountability, transparency, and justice for Janet and all victims of racial profiling. Inside his now eerily quiet apartment, Rick sat alone, staring numbly at the television screen. His face appeared prominently on every news channel, each condemning him as a symbol of systemic discrimination and police misconduct. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves, leaving Rick isolated, engulfed by his shame. Meanwhile, at the FBI Chicago field office, Janet Wilson received unwavering support from her colleagues and superiors. The FBI swiftly issued an official statement condemning Rick's actions and demanding reforms in police practices. Despite the victory, Janet felt deeply saddened by the incident. Her professionalism had prevailed, but the emotional toll lingered. Days later, as the controversy intensified, Rick received an unexpected call. Captain Dawson requested his presence immediately. Nervous and defeated, Rick walked through the precinct halls, head lowered, eyes avoiding those who once respected him. Entering Dawson's office, he found the captain sternly waiting, eyes filled with disappointment and anger. "Sit," Dawson ordered coldly, gesturing to the chair. Rick obeyed quietly, bracing himself for whatever came next. Dawson leaned forward, speaking firmly. "Do you understand the magnitude of what you've done, Howard? This isn't just about your badge. You betrayed the very people you swore to protect." Rick hung his head, voice cracking, barely audible. "I was wrong, sir. I let my prejudice cloud my judgment. I don't expect forgiveness." "Forgiveness isn't mine to give," Dawson replied sharply. "But understanding the damage you've caused is your responsibility. You'll have plenty of time to reflect, because the investigation concluded. You're officially terminated from your duties, effective immediately." Rick swallowed hard, visibly shaken, as Dawson continued. "Consider this your wake-up call. I suggest you use this moment to become a better human being, even if you can no longer serve as an officer." Rick rose slowly, leaving the precinct stripped of his badge, his identity, and his pride. The weight of his actions bore down heavily upon him, forcing a painful reckoning. Meanwhile, Janet stood at her office window, overlooking Chicago's skyline. Her phone vibrated. A text from Captain Dawson, reassuring her that justice had been served. Yet, she knew deeply that true justice meant broader change. Determined, Janet made a choice. She would use this experience as a catalyst to fight harder against prejudice and systemic injustice, understanding clearly now that her strength and position carried the power to ignite change far beyond herself. Weeks passed, and the city of Chicago slowly recovered from the turmoil sparked by Janet Wilson's unjust arrest. Officer Rick Howard, now stripped of his badge and uniform, struggled silently through his new reality. Everywhere he turned, he saw reminders of the damage he had caused, headlines condemning his actions, neighbors avoiding eye contact, and the emptiness within himself he couldn't seem to shake. Haunted by regret, Rick found himself drawn one afternoon to a community center in Chicago's South Side, a place he'd once viewed with disdain. He entered hesitantly, unnoticed among volunteers quietly helping families in need. Watching them work selflessly, Rick felt a pang of shame. For the first time, he began to see the people he'd prejudged as individuals with dreams, struggles, and dignity. As Rick stood awkwardly by the entrance, a familiar voice startled him. "Howard." Rick turned sharply, heart racing. Janet Wilson stood there, her expression composed yet curious, carrying boxes of donations she'd organized through the FBI Community Outreach Program. "Agent Wilson." Rick spoke softly, his voice thick with shame, unable to meet her eyes. "I didn't expect to see you here." Janet placed a box gently on a nearby table and regarded him thoughtfully. "And I didn't expect to see you here either. But I hope you come for the right reasons." Rick sighed deeply, genuine remorse filling his voice. "I've spent weeks thinking about everything I did. Nothing excuses what I've done, but I needed to come here, to see things differently, to learn." Janet remained silent for a moment, evaluating the sincerity behind his words. Finally, she spoke calmly but firmly. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Rick. You must truly commit if you want to heal any wounds you've caused." "I know," Rick admitted humbly. "I can't undo my mistakes, but I want to become a better person. I don't expect forgiveness, only the chance to make amends." Janet nodded slowly, appreciating the humility and vulnerability she saw. "Then start today. Actions speak louder than words." Without another word, Janet handed Rick a volunteer badge. Rick accepted it cautiously, feeling the weight of its symbolism. He moved hesitantly into the community center, joining volunteers who greeted him warmly, unaware of his past. For the first time in his life, Rick worked alongside those he judged unfairly, recognizing their shared humanity. As Janet observed from afar, a quiet hope settled within her heart. She knew true justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation. Though uncertain of Rick's future, she saw clearly that his journey toward redemption had truly begun. Months after the incident that shook Chicago, life had gradually returned to normal, though it carried profound changes. Janet Wilson emerged stronger, her reputation solidified by courage and integrity. She became an influential voice, advocating passionately for police reforms and racial equality throughout the city. Her experiences inspired others to stand firmly against prejudice, sparking positive transformations both within law enforcement and across communities. Rick Howard, now far removed from his former life as a police officer, dedicated himself fully to community service. His work at the community center became a personal redemption journey, earning respect and trust from people who once viewed him with suspicion. Slowly, his presence became synonymous with humility, compassion, and genuine remorse. One afternoon, Janet returned to the community center to lead a public discussion about justice and reconciliation. The room filled quickly, community members eager to listen, learn, and heal. Rick sat quietly in the back row, absorbed in Janet's words, humbled by the powerful message she carried. Our experiences shape us. Janet spoke clearly, commanding the room with graceful authority. But it's our choices afterward that truly define who we become. When the event concluded, Rick approached Janet, gratitude clear in his eyes. I owe you more than an apology, he began humbly. You showed me what real justice and dignity look like. Janet met his gaze, seeing sincerity and genuine change within him. Everyone deserves a second chance to prove they can do better. Rick, just don't waste it. I won't, Rick promised earnestly. You have my word. They exchanged a quiet, respectful nod before parting ways. Janet stepped outside into the fading sunset, satisfied yet deeply aware of the ongoing struggle for equality. Her work was far from finished, but she knew, now more than ever, that one person's voice, bold and unwavering, could ignite powerful change. Meanwhile, Rick returned to the tasks awaiting him, determined to honor the opportunity he'd been given. Though he could never erase the past, he vowed to spend the rest of his life contributing meaningfully to the community he once neglected. The city of Chicago moved forward, shaped profoundly by their story. For both Janet and Rick, this marked not an end, but a hopeful beginning, illuminating a path toward healing, redemption, and justice for all.